And we're back. This is episode 424 of the Colombia Calling podcast. My very special guest this week is Shafik Meghji. He's a renowned travel writer based in Southeast London, but he's written from all over the world. But of course, it's brought to my attention. Not only did he contract me back in 2011, so a lifetime ago, before children and before other things, before pandemic, but he's also, writes quite, I would say profoundly and extensively about Latin America, South America, Bolivia, Colombia, elsewhere. But we're going to chat about everything. Shafik, welcome on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you.
See, we communicate on social media, but we haven't actually spoken since 2011 when we had this sort of, I guess it was kind of like an interview for what was then, I don't know if it's still around, the Nile Guide.
Yeah, it really does. It really doesn't feel that long at all. And because of, social media kind of, gives you an insight or a little snapshot into people's lives. So you feel like you've been kind of keeping up a relationship. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, chatting like this is lovely. And as for Nile Guide, I think it burned brightly and then possibly fizzled out.
Like so many travel related websites and websites as well. And of course, these things come and go, don't they? They're kind of like magazines. They come and go. There's a peak for the interest and so on. I was thinking the other day of the Matador network. That must still be around because it had a huge sort of, drive behind it and the San Francisco techies that did it. But it's certainly not as big as it was back in the day.
It's still going as far as I'm aware, but yeah, I think it's kind of it's certainly not as prominent as it once was. Like so many of the startups that come out of California.
That's right, isn't it? California, San Francisco, and so on. But so tell me a little bit. I mean, first of all, we'll mention it and we'll come back to it. You've got a book out. I've got it. Maybe the only copy in Colombia. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see it's called Crossed Off the Map, Travels in Bolivia. And I've read excerpts here and there because I haven't had time to sit down and read it all. But it's a really in-depth look at, I would say, a lot of South America is misunderstood or just not understood, but Bolivia is particularly one of those countries. So, you are involved with the Latin American bureaus, or this entity that publishes books and reports and so on, all about South America, Central America, Mexico, and so on. How is it you just said, listen, we really need to do something? Like I wouldn't say it's like a political travelogue because everything in Bolivia is political. Everything is. Tell us a little bit about the book and how it came about.
Yeah, I first visited South America and Bolivia in 2004. I was a sports writer at the time, and I was taking an impromptu gap year, really. And at the time, I think like many people outside of Bolivia, outside of Latin America, didn't really know much about Bolivia at all. I was just looking for a convenient and cheap way to get from Brazil, where I'd been enjoying Carnival in Rio. And I wanted to get to Cusco to start the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu, and at the time, I just needed to travel overland through Bolivia. Bolivia was just almost an obstacle for me to get from A to B. But I was so glad I made the journey because as soon as I entered Bolivia and started to travel around it, realized it's such a place of extremes with the highest cities on earth, the biggest salt flat, the highest, largest high altitude lake, the most biodiverse national park, the most dangerous road, so on and so on. And as I traveled through it, it really made an impact. It kind of grabbed hold of me and never let go. And then that journey around South America really prompted me to change careers. Came back to London and I became a travel writer eventually, and started writing guidebooks for Rough Guides. And eventually that led on to work on the Rough Guide to Bolivia around a decade ago. And that really allowed me to explore Bolivia in far greater depth than I would have possibly would have been able to otherwise. And I was also very lucky in that it was a particularly dramatic and turbulent and impactful time in Bolivian history. as well. So I was fortunate from those terms, and really, the idea for the book came from those research trips. As I learned more about the fascinating history of Bolivia, these fragments of history that been forgotten beyond its borders. Thought that's a great story to tell. And then increasingly it felt like the future had already arrived in Bolivia. This was a country that is dealing with the consequences of the climate crisis, has been dealing with the consequences of the climate crisis for many years now. Is dealing with issues like populism and the war on drugs and migration and all of these kind of things that I think will shape all of our lives all around the world, in the years and decades to come. It just seemed like a fascinating story to tell, to kind of both look back at the fascinating history, to look at how Bolivia is also coping with these contemporary challenges, and to bring them together in a book. And I couldn't really believe that someone hadn't done it beforehand. These are so brilliant stories. But I think, like lots of things in Latin America, there's not a great deal of coverage in the English language media, in the international media. That there's not enough books and articles and podcasts and all of these kind of things. So this is my small attempt to try and put that right for Bolivia at least.
And so, I mean, if we're looking at, I guess you said 2004, did you travel through the Chaco then, through Paraguay overland, or did you go straight through from Brazil through Acre, I think it is, into Bolivia?
Yeah, no. So I was in the I traveled through the Pantanal, which obviously most people associate with Brazil, the world's largest tropical wetlands, but Bolivia also has a huge chunk of it too. And so I was traveling through the Bolivian side of it and the Brazilian side of it, across the border into Bolivia, and then took what are known as the death trains that run from the Brazilian border all the way to the city of Santa Cruz, and that was an incredible. You're traveling through the wetlands. You see incredible wildlife from the train. It's got a very evocative history, the train, of course. And then arriving in Santa Cruz was really an eye-opening experience. I'd never been anywhere quite like it before. There were Mennonites that I met. There were the Japanese Bolivian communities there. There were sloths in the trees of the central plaza. There were these huge blacked out 4x4s, these narco cruisers, as they were called. There was the first of many hundreds and hundreds of political protests that I've seen and experienced in Bolivia, with banging pots and pans, and it was kind of an incredibly vivid experience. It kind of grabbed me and shook me, and I think from that moment I was hooked. And absolutely, as I traveled more through the country on that trip, and then subsequently for work for the Rough Guides, that feeling just intensified, really.
So it's kind of the book is kind of, there's a compendium of past stories but brought up to date, isn't it? It's that you're taking in a lot of reflections, which makes it very nice. I also think I mean, for me, I got to Bolivia. How did I get there? I can't remember. Down through Peru the first time. So it was in the early 2000s, before 2004, I think. I can't remember. It's been so long. And then I came through, and there were protests all the time. I mean, all the time. But I had seen protests in Peru prior to the elections, and I'd seen protests in Guatemala, where I'd lived previously, and elsewhere. But Bolivia was the most vivid. And I remember being in La Paz, and of course the main road down the middle, which sort of descends down the bowl, and there's a bridge towards the bottom, and the miners were striking. And this is prior to 2004. I'm absolutely sure it's like 2001, and they were striking over their conditions that they lived in, and the poor pay and so on. And they hung up nooses on the bridge and said they were going to hang themselves because death was better than what they were living. And then the riot police came out, and so the miners started throwing their sticks of dynamite at them. And I was sitting in a kebab shop, as you do, on this road, just behind a glass. And it never occurred to me that I might be in trouble. I was just watching it as if it was on TV, because it was so far it was so far displaced from anything I'd ever seen before. And so this, this all sort of wound down after Dynamite and so on else. And then the next day, there was a women's demonstration in front of that building. I guess it's the Bolivian Institute of Human Rights right there as well. Nice big building, kind of, I think it was like a pink color or something. Anyway, the women, the indigenous women, so the Aymara and the Quechua women were all protesting, and they were protesting in their bras because of the rights. And they said if the government and whoever was involved didn't come out to negotiate or talk to them, they would take their bras off. And I think it was Banzer who was in control, President Banzer, after, obviously not during the dictatorship, but he came back, I guess it was 15, 20 years later. Anyway, that government caved. They said, we are not taking your bras off. We will talk to you. I mean, and I just remember going, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I love it. And then after a while, traveled around the country all over, and then decided I'm going to go to Paraguay and through the Chaco. And I was really, after getting in Santa Cruz and finding a Mexican restaurant, and I looked at it and went, well, there's a lot of people in there. It must be good. And I mistakenly thought there were tourists as well, but they were all the Mennonites dressed in their, their dungarees and straw hats. And they were watching Benny Hill on the big screen. I mean, it was just one of those bizarre, and this was Bolivia in a nutshell. Then I caught the bus from Santa Cruz, and it must have been moving drugs, because we got stopped so many times and there was cash around. And then we got delayed somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And it was, and then there were also they were young ladies who were going off kind of illegally to work as maids in Uruguay. And I mean, everything on my bus, it was the cheapest bus. That's what happened. And I mean, and then as we got into Paraguay, just some Paraguayan kid got up in, I don't know, some rural part of Paraguay. He got onto the bus, and he can't have been older than like 10 or 12. He just decided, I'm going to Asuncion. So he got on because he had the money. And then a little bit further down, we got stopped and the kid got taken off. And you're just like, what's going on here? And then there was another sort of like checkpoint. I guess everyone's getting their cut of each like commission for the movement of this bus. And we all had to go in. And of course, I am a foreigner amongst Peruvians and Bolivians and everyone else. And, they sort of just waved me through. But the Peruvian young ladies were, pretty girls. And I remember that they were from Chiclayo, Northern Peru. And I remember them well. They were going to Uruguay. That was the thing. And the border policeman, or the guy who was checking, the migration guy in Paraguay, said, I'm not going to stamp your passports to the Peruvian girls. And they were like, what? No. We need more pretty girls in Paraguay. So you just stay here. Like that is, of course, these girls started crying and stuff. And the guys, I guess, that he sort of laughed it off as if it was a joke. But at no moment at the beginning was it a joke, no moment. And I just think this whole, again, it was very much, for me, I guess, as an impressionable 22, 23-year-old or whatever I was at the time, it was really seeing a different world that, I traveled a lot, but this was right up and close. And I think with Bolivia, represents that. And if we get onto another subject there, you did mention, it's definitely in the book, the lithium. And we did the capitalism side of things that Bolivia is facing. So no more anecdotes from me. I just went there. But the capitalism side, because this is where Evo Morales comes in, and this the two sides, of course, Santa Cruz and La Paz el Alto, Sucre to another side, really. But this friction in the country, isn't it? It's just. I mean, what's going on now today in 2022 regarding all this? Because I know that we had Janine Añez present for a bit, and now where are we now? Sorry, I mean, bring us up to speed.
It's difficult to say from day to day and hour to hour with any confidence. I mean, during my time traveling, in Bolivia, I kind of saw, experienced the Evo Morales years. I mean, he came to power not long after I first visited, and all the way through the last 10, 15 years of me traveling, he was in power until 2019, and you really saw huge change in the country, huge numbers of people, millions and millions of people brought out of poverty. There's a lot of development. There's a real flourishing of kind of indigenous pride and identity, and a throwing off of long-held repression. But obviously he stayed in power an awful long time, like a lot of people tend to do, the political figures, and stayed in power too long. I mean, one of the anecdotes that I recount in the book is talking to a supporter of Morales in El Alto, which is one of the hotbeds of his support, talking to him in 2016, just before a referendum that would have allowed Morales to stay in power even longer. And he said, his supporter said, I supported him all the way through. He's been the best leader of our country we've ever had. But I won't be voting for him in this referendum. We don't want him to stay in too long. He said, we don't want a king in Bolivia, which I thought was kind of quite a nice way of summing it up. And I think, unfortunately, Morales, although he certainly had a positive impact, it's he also had a negative impact in many aspects of life as well. And I think it's hard to argue that he didn't stay in power too long. Anyway, scroll forward to 2019, which because of the pandemic seems like another world, and certainly in Bolivian politics as well. And it looked like there was another general election, even though there was a lot of unhappiness with him running again. It did look like he was going to be re-elected, but then there were, after the vote, there were allegations of electoral fraud, accusations one way or another, and eventually, protests on the streets. And eventually he was asked, I use inverted commas around asked. He was asked to leave for the good of the country by military figures, and then he left, and in the power vacuum, it was taken over by in some ways the polar opposite of him, an extremely right-wing, staunch Christian figure in Áñez. And there was huge amounts of human rights abuses and repression and so on, and obviously they had to deal with the pandemic as well, which obviously broke out a few months later, and Bolivia, like many parts of the world, was very badly affected by that. Trying to bring it up to date in a concise way, which is always a bit of a challenge. Now, the MAS party, the party of Morales, is back in power. They were overwhelmingly, democratically elected, and Morales himself, who was in exile in Mexico first and then in Argentina, is now back in the country, although not in the presidential palace. So and really they're going through a something of a reckoning about what happened during the election, and the human rights abuses that happened during the period after it, as well as trying to cope with the pandemic, and cope with the climate crisis, and cope with all these other issues that are major issues for Bolivia particularly. So it's it is always, whenever you visit, it is always an interesting time politically in Bolivia.
Well, watch this segue, how I move it over to Colombia now. But no, I think what you talk about and what you've been mentioning and what you write about, there's so much of it can be transposed quite directly to other countries in Latin America. There is, I don't know if it's because they're neighbors and they see from one another and so on, but this issue of staying in power too long, the issue of climate change, which it should be at the forefront of every political, do we still say manifesto, or every political campaign, because it truly affects the people and, of course, the most at risk. And when you look at like El Alto, or you look at other parts of Bolivia, it's the big mountain, Illimani, I want to say, something like that.
Illimani, but yes, that overlooks a beautiful mountain that overlooks La Paz and El Alto.
And all of these things that are definitely affected. I mean, here in Colombia, everywhere. I mean, where I am in Bogota, and the floods, or then the droughts, and when then elsewhere around the country, it's everything, landslides all the time. But the politics, and you had Evo Morales, who, had he not wished to hold on to power, would have probably gone down as one of the most positive presidential periods in South American history, I would say. You know, I'm not saying that everything he did was right, but when you look at the bar was pretty low as well. Banzer, it was a Quiroga, I want to say, and then Mesa, and who's the El Gringo? I can't remember his name. They called someone Gringo.
Yeah, well, there was
Lozano?
Goni, who you might be thinking of, who was very wealthy and was deposed just, or was toppled just before Morales came to power. But yeah, it's a motley bunch, and particularly, certainly initially, Morales was a hugely influential figure. I mean, the most influential figure in Bolivian history over the last 100 years, and I'd say certainly one of the most influential figures in South American history over 100 last 100 years or so. But yeah, it's a common problem. It's not a problem limited to South America. Far from it. Of people, not political figures, not leaving at the right moment, or not knowing when to leave at the right moment, or not being nudged out of the way at the last, but before they ruin their before they ruin their record. And I think I think unfortunately that's probably happened with Morales.
It happens all too much. And now, is he in a position where he is, let's put this carefully, advising the current government? Is it a puppet government? I mean, this is the question.
No. No. From my experience, I think it's they've got I'll say it's a capable, they've got it's a capable and different leadership to Morales, and I think Morales would obviously like to have influence with him, but I think the leadership has also, as far as I'm aware, kind of tried to put a bit of distance between themselves and Morales, because there was opposition to Morales pre-2019 from both the right and the left. It's kind of it's like everything in life, and particularly in Bolivia, it's a very nuanced situation. There were lots of different criticisms of him, and it wasn't just a kind of reactionary far right response to him, although that was certainly present as well. So I think probably wisely the new leadership is trying to strike its own course. It's to show that the party is bigger than Morales. But Morales is a huge figure. He remains hugely popular within certain parts of the population, and he's a strong character, to put it mildly. So is this the end of his story? I would strongly suspect not.
Yeah, there'll be some influence in decades to come of this. Of course there will, and then of course after his time, it will still be looking back. It's amazing, really. And there was one mention in the book, and I didn't follow up though, and you did talk, and I'm again going off on a digression here, but you mentioned the San Pedro prison. Did you get in the end?
No. So this is an interesting story, and I think it kind of it speaks to something that as a travel writer, you kind of one of the issues that you kind of come across a lot. So on my first visit as a backpacker, when I was a sports reporter before changing my career, becoming a travel writer, I'd read the books about Marching Powder, the very famous book about life in San Pedro prison in La Paz. And when I was there, I met other travelers, other backpackers that had gone into the prison and had a tour, and got up to all kinds of activity. And I was a much younger man at the time. I kind of less perhaps aware of what are the negative consequences of these kind of things. So I was quite keen to go in, but however, there'd been some security issues while I was in La Paz, and they'd tightened everything up, and just for those few weeks, they weren't you weren't able to get in. So I never actually got in, and in retrospect, I'm really glad that I didn't, because you know, it's kind of, it's a voyeuristic time kind of tourism, really. And it's, you know, the tours have been linked with you know, a lot of problems in the prison. You know, prisoners' families are often in the prison with them. There's serious problems of violence and abuse, and some of these have been linked with tours and backpackers going in naively or for a great story to tell. And you know, there's definitely periods of my life when I was younger that, you know, that I wouldn't have thought and would have done the same. So yeah, so I never went in, and I'm glad I didn't. But I, you know, I you know, I do write about this a little bit in the book, because it's a fascinating, you know, it's another window into a certain aspect of Bolivian life, of where, you know, the prisoners are required to, you know, buy, in inverted commas, or rent their own cells. If you can't afford to do that, you know, you're essentially, you know, sleeping outside, and you're suffering very badly. If, however, you have lots of money, if you're a you know, if you've been made a lot of money through political corruption or through drug trafficking or something else, you know, your cell can resemble a, you know, a 5-star hotel room. So yeah, it's a real, it's a society and microcosm inside the prison. And interestingly, it's you know, this fascination with life in Bolivia's prisons or South American prisons isn't a new phenomenon at all. You know, one of the texts that I used to research the book was written by an American in the 1910s, and he visited, you know, and he visited you know, the prisons in La Paz to get an insight, and no doubt to indulge in a bit of you know, voyeuristic tourism. So yeah, so it's, you know, if people are thinking of visiting, I would strongly advise not to do so for various reasons.
Well, I didn't get in either. I would have, at that age, I would have probably killed to have got in for the stories, you know, to one-upmanship as a backpacker. However, as a sort of social projects guide or and so on, when I was in Quito with a group of English gap year students, we did used to make trips into the Quito women's prison and the men's prison. It was incredibly voyeuristic, but part of it was within their first week of arriving, and I was with them for 3 months, and it was to stop them from wanting to get involved in anything illicit. And it was a very good way, but it always terrified me. And the third time I was going to go in, of course, the police only control the door, you know, to get in and to get out. And they said, well, and you had to get a stamp on your, you know, the underside of your forearm, and a stamp that said you could come out. So like almost like a migration stamp for your passport. And they said, well, we can stamp you in, but we can't stamp you out. And I'm like, what is it? Well, no, there's a riot going on, so you can go in, but we can't guarantee you can get out. And I was like, yeah, we're just not going in. But so we would always visit the English people, and we'd sit in their cell and they would talk to us. And it was always just like, my God. But I think at the end of it, we ended up in one of the sort of top end wings, as you would say, and there were hanging baskets of flowers, bougainvillea from the thing. There was a burger bar where they were flipping burgers in the corner, and everyone had their own TV. A lot were Colombians because they'd been involved in, you know, narcotics. And I recall the day it was Manchester United was playing Exeter City in the FA Cup. Now, I went to Exeter University way back for my undergrad, and I remember, so I had a soft spot for Exeter City. I stuck my head into one of the cells. I said, oh, look, my team's playing. He was Colombian. He smiled at me. Yeah, Manchester's a great team. I went, no, the other one. He went, what, the shit one? so there you go. That's my story, my one-upmanship. But I understand exactly what you're saying. And as an older individual now, I'm completely aware, but I would have been totally unaware. But it was a different time. It was a different practice, and it was for, you know, and a different motive as well. But I think, you know, we've been talking for a long time, but I mean, Bolivia, of course, is very topical for you because of the book. How has the reception been?
It's been really good so far.
Yeah.
I mean, it came out on the 15th of March, and it's been it's been a real whirlwind of interviews and talks and articles and so on. But it's been I've had a lovely response from readers, and that's really been a gratifying kind of experience. It seems to have chimed with quite a lot of people.
Yeah.
And for me, it's just it's been I'm hugely passionate, an evangelist for visiting Bolivia, for championing Bolivia. So so it's been nice to kind of see the book out and kind of really take it to a new audience, really, and to kind of publicize Bolivia a bit to people that may not have heard about it before. And actually, at least one reader has said that they're booking some flights, having read the book to visit, which is that's the nicest possible compliment you can get when you write those kind of books. And also because it's kind of as much as I love Bolivia and there's a lot of positive things about it, and I talk about the incredible landscapes, the wonderful national parks, the Salar de Uyuni and Titicaca and all of these places, it doesn't shy away from the more difficult or the darker aspects of the country. So I'm delighted I've at least prompted one person to travel out and to explore Bolivia for themselves.
Well, this is it. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, crossed off the map, travels in Bolivia. There it is. It's really, what I have read has been great. And as you say, I don't think you should shy away from the more difficult points. I mean, again, it's all complex from Colombia all the way down, from Colombia all the way up. It's all complex. And this is one of my issues I have, and I've talked about it before, is this country branding campaigns that I suppose everywhere has them. I think Ecuador always focuses on the Galapagos, which again is a tiny, tiny part of what Ecuador has to offer. Brazil usually then focuses on Carnival. Again, that spreads across the country, but people have the image of Rio and the Sambadrome, and Panama is the canal, and there's all these different things. Guatemala's was always quite good for me because it was like the heart of the Maya world, which it's not wrong because it does extend across the country. But for Colombia, I don't know what Bolivia, if they have a country sort of branding, but Colombia for me is one of those things is we can't turn our back on the negatives. It's not about embracing it, but it's about coming to terms with it. And I think that's what you do in the book as well, is that you are bringing it out. You've got talks about the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay, where and Paraguay's nonsensical attacks on these things and so on. It is important, and it is very much in the region. But because I would say, after sort of colonial period, I'm not going to go back before that. This is from colonial period to now is a very contemporary culture, and of course a search for identity, and you address that in the book, because that is what it is. And this is something I've been trying to work on with my own projects in Colombia, is what is an identity of a country like Colombia or like Bolivia. Bolivia, I would say, has got further, having elected Morales. There is an acceptance of the original, what would you call it, Aboriginal, so the original people of the land. Of course, the population is much, much larger. Let's say the indigenous original people, the Quechua, Aymara, and so on. Colombia, it's a minority. Of course, it is to the whites and the mestizos and so on. But it's this question that is constantly there about these identities. And I wonder, and I'm picking your brains because I'm thinking about some of the articles that you did recently about Colombia. You've done Providencia for the BBC, so the paradise island just off Nicaragua, basically. So the sister island to San Andres, which is not my most favorite place, but Providencia is amongst them. I think I've been 2 or 3 times. Tom Filing did a book on that as well. He was on the podcast maybe 200 episodes ago or so. You wrote a piece on the Llanos. So, so if you go south of Bogota to Meta, the Llanos, and then over or to Casanare for Wanderlust, and you were with friends of mine who have operators there, Julia Andres, Wild Llanos, which is just amazing. And you wrote another piece to discover the real Colombia, and you've written a piece about Chicha for Tonic Mag. These are all incredibly different articles. You know, you couldn't take one thing out of them and say this is Colombia. I mean, how do you feel about this?
I mean, to be honest, this kind of sums up my writing career, in that I'm drawn to these kind of stories. I mean, I think I turn your question on its head, in really, that I think, you know, all of us have multiple identities, and countries particularly. And, you know, as you say, in tourism branding campaigns, you know, it often reduces it down to a single image or a single aspect of you know, Bolivia, for example, is often seen as an Andean country, and people think of it as mountains, and that's how it's sold. A third of it is in the Amazon basin, you know, and kind of, and the rest of it is wetlands, and so yeah, I'm always interested in kind of looking beyond the stereotypes and trying to explore, you know, identities or aspects of the of countries, or in fact geographical areas that are often overlooked. And that's what I really tried to do when I was in Colombia, because, you know, Colombia is incredibly diverse, of course, but, you know, often, say from a touristic point of view, it's the Andes and the Caribbean that are sold, and rightly so. There's fantastic places to visit in both, but a lot of these stories have been told, you know, repeatedly, and you know, I'm always interested to look at stories that haven't been told and that are underappreciated, and to, you know, see what light they shine on the country, and also maybe, you know, encourage people to explore and to read further. And so, you know, I initially came out to research, you know, a story in the Llanos, and an absolutely incredible region, and you know, and to spend some time with the Llaneros, with the cowboys, to see how their traditional lifestyles are continuing, to see how that intersects with issues like conservation, to explore some you know, some really wonderful and positive sustainable tourism operations around these private reserves, which are set around the atolls, these massive cattle ranches, and also, you know, on the same trip, almost as far away from the Llanos as you can get, to Providencia, which is, you know, while I was there, someone described it as the least Colombian part of Colombia. I think slightly tongue in cheek, but it's obviously, you know, it doesn't fit, you know, in many ways in cultural terms with what outsiders might perceive of Colombia. I guess even what many Colombians would perceive as themselves. But I think, you know, and Providencia, quite apart from being, you know, hands down one of the most beautiful places to visit, not just in Colombia, in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's wonderful for diving. It's has beautiful beaches. But yeah, the history of it, and the identity of the people. They have a different language. Their typical religious beliefs are often different. It's got a very distinctive history of pirates and Puritans and you know, slave owners from Jamaica, and indigenous settlers from Central America. And it's a real kind of, you know, I won't use the melting pot, you know, cliche, but it's a real mix of different cultures, and it's got a very, you know, a fascinating history. And all of that is kind of, you know, that you can explore in, you know, surrounded by some of the, you know, the most beautiful waters and diving spots, you know, on Earth. And it was kind of both of those stories appeal to me because
You're back.
good.
We will cut that a little bit up, but if I could jump in, the history really appeals to me about Providencia. I mean, the history of this, and obviously, you know, we're all kind of taken by the somewhat romantic, obviously very tragic history, the piracy and so on, and of course Henry Morgan launching his sacking of Panama from Providencia. And if there's any pirate experts out there, I've been doing my research, and one of the pirates who was sort of launching one wing, I guess, of this attack was called Lawrence Prince. Now, Lawrence Prince was actually Dutch, so it's Laurens Prins, Prins. Now, just before going on with Henry Morgan, he had sailed up the Magdalena to try and sack Montpos, and I haven't found any more than just that mention. And that's one of my big investigations. So please, anyone out there, and I was wondering, in your research on Providencia, did you find anything?
I mean, I would love to just pull out of my back pocket a yellow document that provides new insight into this story. Sadly, not. Other than that, there was a big Dutch pirate presence on the island, and some of the initial settlers. It was thought to be initially uninhabited before the pirates arrived, and then they were replaced by the Puritans, who were then replaced by the Spanish, who were then replaced by more pirates. But there was a strong Dutch presence, but obviously both in the pirates and through the Puritan settlers from the UK. So I'm sure there are people out there better qualified than me that will be able to shed some light, because it's a fascinating story, and I think there's so many of those kinds of stories of kind of the European presence in during the early colonial periods in that part of the Caribbean, and there's some incredible stories still to unearth.
It's true, but so I mean we've been going over these things, and I think the last thing we need to talk about is because the magazine is so print and we can't get it online. Tonic magazine, you wrote about chicha, so the traditional, I would say, South American fermented drink. And we've tried it in all sorts of countries, but you wrote about the Colombian chicha, and I know now that there's quite a high-end chicha coming out that's being exported internationally. Tell us a bit about the chicha and the story there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like lots of people, so much of my travel is primarily through my stomach. It's kind of led by that. And but I think also food and drink is also it's a great route into a country. To writing about it kind of gives people a bit of an insight and throws them into it. So while I was researching the Providencia story and the Llanos story, I spent some time in Bogota, looking into the history of Chicha for Tonic magazine, which was launched during the pandemic, an excellent magazine actually. And it's I've had Chicha in various parts of the world, including in Bolivia, in Cochabamba, supposedly the best Chicha that can be had in Bolivia. But the story in Colombia, I thought really shed light on Colombia's history, and it was almost a prism to explore Colombia's history, or certainly a part of Colombia's history. And so I kind of delved into the ancient indigenous origins of it, and that it was a sacred drink and what it was used for, and that when the conquistadors arrived initially, they were very interested in it, but then there was a lot of pushback because traditionally the chicha makers were indigenous women, often single women who had a lot of status and social power and economic power within their societies, which didn't really chime with the beliefs of the Spanish. And then over the centuries since chicha became really a drink of the working class, but also faced prohibition and a lot of stigmatization, including by the governments and including by leading brewers who knocked up these incredible pieces of propaganda, really, which are promoting the values of drinking a healthy pint of European beer and associating it with modernity and health and modernity and Europeans specifically, whilst casting light on chicha as if it was somehow leads to criminality and sexual proclivity and corruption and all of these kind of things, and that this is something in the past, and that modern brewed beer is the future. And then in the Bogotazo, so the hugely important event in Colombian history, chicha is involved in that too, and the authorities even blamed a lot of the violence and the unrest on chicha, and used it as an excuse essentially to ban it. And it was kind of to a certain extent, it was banned until I think it was 1991 or so. And that although it remained popular in indigenous communities, the chicherias, the bars in which you would drink chicha, which I think at the turn of the 20th century there were around 800 in Bogota alone. So these were quite, they were significant places, and there were places where people would meet and maybe talk about politics and identity and why they were unhappy with the government and why they were not receiving enough wages for their jobs and all of these kind of things. So the nice story, the nice part of the story is that it's having something of a renaissance now, because fermented products all around the world, kimchi and kombucha and all of these kind of things have had a real renaissance in recent years. It's viewed as very healthy and kind of lots of beneficial aspects of them. And to a certain extent, something's happening with Chicha as well. And I met some chefs who are doing really wonderful things with it, using it in their high-end creative cooking, producing beautiful vinegars with it, producing their own artisan versions to drink. And of course, if you go to Candelaria, and you walk and see where the students are, you can go and get chicha today, and it's still thriving there. So it was a really interesting issue to explore. A drink that's got ancient origins, but is still very relevant today as well.
That's the point about the sort of banning, the prohibition, and of course the image, the lie being sold of the primitive nature, the past. We're looking to the future. I had one of my Patreon supporters ask me a question and asked me to find a chef to talk about Colombian food, believed amongst many, myself not included, because there are dishes here that are very tasty and very sort of varied in their flavors, but standard food is your let's fill and stick to your ribs because you're going out to work in the fields. Colombia was until recently a very rural country, but now the majority of the population has moved into urban areas and so on. But she said that she had heard or read many years ago or many months ago that the indigenous foods and traditional indigenous foods, so such as, and chicha would fall under that category, and that being prohibited by the Spanish. So therefore, that has resulted in the more bland food in Colombia today. I found it a very interesting concept. It's not something I had thought about. There could be some truth to it, I suppose, if you're trying to suppress the previous culture, the existing culture, and then bring in and introduce other things, whatever they may be, perhaps that is a way of altering a culinary culture. I don't know, but you've just brought it up for me, but I thought it was a very interesting point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look around the world, so often food and drink is tied in with identity, with national identity or regional identity, and so on. And during the colonial period, not just in Colombia but across the world, it was to try and create a new identity, to stamp on a new identity, and that meant often that traditional foodstuffs and drinks, as well as other aspects of culture, had to be repressed or pushed aside or so on. And that was certainly the case with chicha in Colombia. As I said, the conquistadors were initially fascinated with it. They'd had huge long journeys, and it was plentiful alcohol as well. So, but it didn't take long, and it often with the authorities to look down on it and try and repress it or stifle it, often involving the church. I think that the church would try and encourage its congregation not to frequent these chicherias where who knows what might have been discussed amongst who knows who. So I mean, I think chicha is just one of those stories, but I think you could probably travel across Latin America and indeed further afield and find foods and drinks and so on that tell similar kinds of stories. And often, we don't know so much about them now. I mean, I was definitely struck with writing the piece about Chicha, in that I got a really good response from Colombians as well about it, and particularly Colombians who hadn't, obviously knew about it but didn't perhaps kind of hadn't tried it, or would certainly hadn't tried it since their student days. And so it was it was interesting to hear that. And obviously because it also there's a very different attitude to it there compared to say Bolivia. If you go to Cochabamba, one of the major cities, there's chicheria everywhere, and it's there isn't the stigma that would have been applied to it, however many hundreds of kilometers, thousands of kilometers further north. And I think it's remarkably resilient. It's a resilient drink. It's been drunk for thousands of years, and it's survived this far, which I think is admirable.
Do you think the English version would be like mead?
Yeah, I mean it's probably types of beer, various types of beer. In some ways, Chicha is a type of beer, and the types of beers have been brewed for millennia in cases, and I'm sure that there'll be regional versions of that in the UK. I mean, certainly if you're in I don't know, say like place like Nottingham with a very strong brewing tradition, there'll be a lot of identification with the with the beers that they produce. But I mean, there's a fantastic story, no doubt, to be written about the British equivalent of Chicha. Maybe after we finish this podcast, that might be something I'll look into for my next piece.
And then come and research it, and I'll invite you to a Chicha. Well, no, actually, you could show me. You probably know the places better than I do. But I think that's a very good part to end on. And I'd like to say thank you so much for your time. We've been talking to Shafik Meghji, very renowned travel writer. Book out now. Get it if you're in the slightest bit interested in Latin American politics. This goes far into it. It's called Crossed Off the Map. Travels in Bolivia. You can find it on his website. You can find it on Latin American Bureau's website. Everywhere else you'll find it. And of course, the reception has been very good because I guess it's the first of its kind. So congratulations on that. And thank you for coming on this episode 424 of the Colombia Calling podcast.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. The time's flown by.
It has. So thank you again. And I hope that when we get more, there's more writing down the line and more books that you've written, we'll have you back on to reflect as well, because, we reflected on San Pedro and not having gone in and what we would have been like at age 18 or 20. Now I'm in my mid 40s and I think, 2 kids down and things are quite different. So listen, have a good rest of the week and weekend, and thank you for your time. And I'm sure we'll be talking again in the near future.
Thanks very much, Richard. Look forward to chatting to you again soon.
It's a pleasure. This has been episode 424 of the Colombia Calling podcast. Remember to check out our sponsors. Messages from them in just a second.